Welcome to lesson 1, and where is the earth changing? And this is for activity 1.3. So if we're looking in our book, where are we going to be in our book this year? Well, in this year we're on page 12, and as always, depending on what year you're listening to this video, you got to be careful because the publishers will sometimes switch the pages around a little bit. They'll add a page here, take a page out, they'll add a activity. So the pages sometimes will shift, but you should be on activity 1.3, earthquakes, volcanoes, and world elevation. So we've taken a look at earthquakes and where earthquakes are located around the earth. And that was in 1.2. We've also taken a look at volcanoes in 1.1. Where are volcanoes located? So this is going to tie together elevation, and then it's ultimately going to tie together all three: elevation, earthquakes, and volcanoes. So what I like you to do first, and you're going to jot this down in your book, so make sure you have your book with you. If for some reason you don't have a book, just put it on another sheet of paper, and you can always staple this into your book, and I'll give you credit for doing it. So if you're at home and you're sick and you're not able to make it to school, put it on another sheet of paper, just copy down the questions, the answers. I will give you credit for it. Just staple it in your book, that way you have it for the test. So first thing I'd like you to do is make a prediction. What do you think the Earth looks like in areas with larger numbers of earthquakes and volcanoes? So here is a map that combines both. The yellow are your earthquakes, so you can see them all over the Earth. And the red, and they're a little bit harder to see, but you have some red there, and that's your volcanoes. So what do you think the Earth looks like in areas with larger numbers of earthquakes and volcanoes? And a hint could be to think about where you think the Earth is higher and lower in relation to where earthquakes and volcanoes occur. So go ahead, pause the video, and just write down a sentence or two. What do you think the Earth looks like in areas with larger numbers of earthquakes and volcanoes? All right, so you've had a chance to make a prediction. Make sure you're making these predictions beforehand, because we're going to come back at the end and see if your prediction was correct. So this is what we're going to do for the activity today. I'm going to show you a world map showing the elevation, which is the height of different areas of the Earth. In general, when you look at this map, darker areas are lower elevations and lighter areas are higher elevation. However, all parts of the continents are higher than any part of the ocean. And in other words, what I'm saying is when you look at these darker areas and these lighter areas, so this is darker, this is darker. I don't want you to think that, well, because this is darker and then this is a lighter color, that this is going to be a greater elevation. No, the land's going to be higher than the oceans. And this hopefully makes sense to you, because if it doesn't make sense to you, think about what would happen if the oceans were actually a higher elevation than the land. Well, they would be flooding the land, so they would be the ocean themselves. So look at the map for patterns and elevation, and discuss this with your team or your group. What do you see? What do you observe? So on page 12, where do you see particular high or low areas in the oceans? So you can do this as a complete sentence, 1 or 2 sentences, or if you just want to use this as bullet points and just list some key things. Where do you see particularly shallow or deep areas in the oceans? And once you get done with that, you're going to do number 2. Where do you see particularly high or low areas in the continents? And that will be on the top of page 13. So go ahead, pause the video, discuss it with your team. What have you come up with? And jot down as many different things that you've observed as possible. And then on pause when you're done. All right, so you've had a chance to take a look at that. And your observations we're going to come back to. If we were doing this in class, if you're absent, obviously you're not in class, or if you're doing it because you've chosen to do the activity individually versus with your team, you may not be involved with the discussion. But in class, we're going to discuss this and we're going to take a look. But we're also going to come back to talking about this in the making sense questions. What patterns do you notice in elevation? So we're going to come back to it and we're going to discuss this in a little bit. So when we move on, letter D in the procedure says, compare the elevation map with the volcano and earthquake maps. So this is what you just saw. And this is all the elevations that you saw with the land and with the ocean. So you might have said things that were very, very similar to what you said with the earthquakes and volcanoes. Did you say that a lot of the higher elevations on the land seem to be on the edges of continents when we look here? But there are some places that aren't. So when we talked about earthquakes, when we talked about volcanoes, a lot of times you mentioned that they were on the sides of the continents and that they follow these patterns, that they were longer areas. But look right here. Do you see this longer, lighter blue here? Does that correspond with this right here? Notice what you see here on the map on top that I'm going over with the cursor. Notice what you see here. So we see that there's a lot of similarities when we look at them. So on page 13, jot down some of these things. What is the elevation like in these areas? So where you see the earthquakes and volcanoes, what is the elevation like in these areas? Does it tend to be higher or does it tend to be lower? All right, so now that you've had a chance to do that, let's move on. So letter D in your book, procedure D says you're going to talk with your team about the patterns that you observe as well as examples that you do not seem to fit the patterns. Actually, this should be E, so I'm going to change this right now. So I apologize for this if you haven't already figured this out this year. The publishers changed almost all the letters to numbers and the numbers to letters for some odd reason. So I don't always get and fix all of them from where they were last year. So talk with your group about the patterns that you observe as well as examples that do not seem to fit the pattern. You don't have to write anything down yet, but what I want you to do is work through the making sense questions 1 through 3 with your group. And you're going to use these maps. So I'm going to put this back up. So if you're at home and you're doing it, that way you can be looking at it. But the 3 questions: what patterns do you notice in elevation in areas with high volcanic and earthquake activity? What ideas do you have about why there are these patterns? And why do you think there are such large areas with relatively few volcanoes and earthquakes? So go ahead, pause the video on these maps, and go ahead and answer making sense questions 1 through 3 with your group, or if you're working obviously by yourself, you don't have a group, you're going to complete these by yourself. And then just hit the unpause button or the play button when you're done. All right, so you've had a chance to go through the making sense questions. So let's take a look at them. First question: what patterns do you notice in elevation in areas with high volcanic and earthquake activity? So if I was to look at the answer key here, one of the things you should have noticed is that there's lots of earthquakes and volcanoes, and they're located in areas with relatively high elevation on the continents. In the oceans, earthquakes are associated with higher elevation as well. However, not all high elevation areas are locations of a high volcanic and seismic activity. So what is that saying? Well, when you looked at the land, a lot of these higher areas, you tended to see a lot of earthquakes and volcanoes. Now, why is it different than in the oceans? Well, you have your deeper areas and you have your shallow areas. Well, remember, your shallow areas are also your higher elevations, but it's your higher elevations in the oceans. Because think about it, if it's shallow, that means the surface, the ocean floor is a lot closer to the surface of the earth. So these wider areas are your higher elevations. And when we look, there seems to be a lot of earthquakes there. There's also some volcanoes and red dots in there as well, but there seems to be a lot of earthquakes in there. So a lot of the earthquakes and volcanoes are located in areas with relatively high elevations on the continents. In the oceans, earthquakes are associated with higher elevations as well. However, not all high elevations are areas where you're going to find high volcanic and seismic activity. So there's a good chance you're going to find them there, but it's not always the case. And in some of these locations, like here in the Himalaya Mountains, you're going to have a few volcanoes, but you're going to have a lot more earthquakes. Where you tend to see a lot more volcanoes around the Pacific Ocean. So you can see there's a lot more red there than you have right along here. So it's not always a perfect match, but it does come pretty close. So what ideas do you have about why there are these patterns? And we're going to get into that next. And why do you think there are such large areas with relatively few volcanoes and earthquakes? So hopefully you've had a chance to discuss this with your team, and we're going to talk about numbers 2 and number 3 next. So I'm going to show you another map. And you may have seen a map like this. You've studied plate tectonics in the past in elementary school. You may have touched upon it in 6th grade as well. We know that our planet is broken up into many plates, and these plates together make up the Earth's surface. These plates are different shapes and size mix. So when we talk about plates, we're not thinking about the plates that you eat spaghetti on. We're talking about tectonic plates. And tectonic plates are going to be all of the Earth's crust and the very, very top part of the mantle, and they call this the lithosphere. So sometimes they call them lithospheric plates, but a lot of times you refer to them as tectonic plates or just plates in general. We know that the plate boundaries or borders are usually under oceans or along the edges of continents, rarely crossing continents. Do they cross continents? Yeah. Every once in a while, you'll see the San Andreas Fault is over land, and you see right over here, you've got some going over land over in the Eurasian plate. So they do go over land, but it's not as common. A lot of times it's going to fall on the edges of plates or the edges of continents or underneath the ocean floor. Now, continents do not define plates. Both continents and oceans can be part of the same plate. So, for example, you have the North American plate. It's a lot of North America, but it's also a lot of the Atlantic Ocean. The South American plate is not just South America. It's the South American continents as well as a lot of the southern and, I guess, to the west, the western part of the southern Atlantic Ocean. The African plate, same way. It's not just the continent of Africa, but it also consists of a lot of ocean as well. Now, the entire surface is made up of plates with no gaps or spaces between the plates. And think about it. If there was gaps between the plates, what would there be? Would you just be, walking on the plate and all of a sudden you fall off to the middle of the earth? No. Now, some scientists will tell you that they don't always know what's going on with the plate boundaries. And we're going to take a look at plate boundaries later on in this book. And sometimes the plate boundaries are a little mysterious, whereas scientists don't know exactly what's happening at that point. But yet there's not going to be these huge gaps where there are no plate boundaries. So we're going to finish up the lab today. And if you look at procedure F, it says, I'm going to give you one more world map. And what we're basically doing is looking at all 4 maps together. So when you look at this map here, you notice you have the elevation, you have the lighter and the darker colors. You have the plates that you just saw. You have the red dots, meaning the volcanoes, and the yellow dots, meaning the earthquake. So here in this map is the ultimate map. We just combine all 4 things: elevation, earthquakes, volcanoes, as well as the plate boundaries. And what I want you to do with these is I want you to complete making sense questions 1 through 3, the next set of 1 through 3. And you can find that on page 50. And again, page numbers may vary from year to year, depending on the edition of your book. So go ahead, pause the video, and complete these 3 questions. When you're done with them, unpause the video. We're going to discuss them a little bit more, and we have one more scientific principle to cover. So once you're on this page, go ahead, pause the video, and complete questions 1 through 3 with your team. All right, so you've had a chance to complete questions 1 through 3. So question 1, what can you conclude based on the pattern you observed across all 4 maps? Well, one of the things you can come up with is that the plate boundaries, which are the dark black lines, are associated with areas of high volcanic and seismic activity. And this is pretty interesting. If I go back to these maps, do you see that right here where it combines earthquakes and volcanoes? Did you notice that it kind of outlines the plates? In fact, some of you might have already come up with that these all seem to be on plate boundaries. I know we talked about them being on the edges of the continents, but I didn't want to hint or lead you to talking about the plates as of yet. But if you notice that a lot of these are associated, or they're actually located where you find the plate boundaries. So if we look at just the plate boundaries, you can see it there, And then when we look at it here, again, earthquakes, volcanoes fall right around a lot of these plate boundaries. So that might have been one of the main ideas that your team came up with. This is nearly always true. You almost always find high volcanic and seismic activity around the plate boundaries. And some land areas may have many earthquakes and several volcanoes, but they do not align with a plate boundary. And we're going to start talking about things like hot spots in the future, where you may not have a plate boundaries, but you're going to have a lot of volcanic activity. And if you have a lot of volcanic activity, you're probably also going to have a lot of earthquakes as well. So the areas of high elevation seem to be aligned to plate boundaries in some locations. However, it's not always a perfect match. Now, what have you heard about plate tectonics? Again, we're going to get more into plate tectonics later into this book, so we're going to talk about it more then. And what new questions do you have about where the Earth is changing based on the data you've looked at all four maps? So again, science is a curious subject. Hopefully, when you get one question answered here and there, you're thinking of 4, 5, 6 other questions that you have. And that's the neat thing about science, is always more questions to ask. And then you're always searching for more answers, and ultimately it's going to lead you to more questions. So we're going to end today's video with a scientific principle. And the scientific principle, the Earth's surface is made up into interlocking plates of various shapes and sizes. So if you have your book, go to the front of your book, and where it says scientific principles, it's the one where it's line pages. The blank pages are for your notes. If you want to add notes, that way you can use them on the test. So go ahead and add this as number 1. The Earth's surface is made up of interlocking plates of various shapes and sizes. And as always, once you finish this video, make sure if you have any questions, you ask your teacher. Thanks, and good job with the lesson. Bye.